Hello, History of Sexuality students. This is Professor Bowen here with some comments on our Week 12 discussions of sexuality in early Soviet Russia. In last week's Telegram conversation, I was really fascinated by all of the photographs and images some of you shared of Russian men kissing. The most famous example of this, from the 20th century at least, is probably the famous socialist fraternal kiss of Leonid Brezhnev and Erich Honecker, which happened in 1979 during a celebration to mark the 30th anniversary of the founding of the German Democratic Republic, that is, East Germany. In 1990, the Russian painter Dmitry Vrubel immortalized the two men locking lips in a bit of Berlin Wall art called "My God, Help Me to Survive This Deadly Love." Vrubel's painting has since gone on to inspire similar, entirely fictitious works, like the 2016 street art mural Make Everything Great Again, which depicts then U.S. President Donald Trump kissing Vladimir Putin. As some of you noted, these kinds of displays of brotherly love were fairly common during the Soviet period. And the additional examples you shared of this, including those from World War II and others depicting the Sino-Soviet alliance, provide ample evidence of this tradition. At first glance, these posters and photos seem to be quite homoerotic. They seem to suggest that the Soviet Union was uniquely tolerant of same-sex relations between men. Was this the case? And if so, why was this kind of behavior considered to be manly, while other seemingly less deviant gender transgressive behaviors were more heavily policed? Were these representations of pederasty? How exactly were they perceived? And how does all of this align with the whole "there was no sex in the Soviet Union" concept? As a way of getting into these questions, I should note that the famous photo of Brezhnev kissing Honecker has appeared in a lot of interesting places, including many places one would not expect to find it. An example of this is the historian John Boswell's book, which is called Same-Sex Unions in Pre-Modern Europe. Even though Boswell's book, which was published in the 1980s, says nothing at all about 20th century Russia, nevertheless, we find this photograph of Brezhnev and Honecker within its pages, as we do a Soviet postage stamp from 1968 also showing two men kissing. So why did Boswell, who's talking about pre-modern Europe, include photographs from a time and place that had nothing to do with his research on pre-modern Europe? Images of men kissing other men, he argues, were not shocking to Russians, who entertained less horror of homosexual interaction than did their Western contemporaries. In one sense, Boswell is right. Russians were not shocked by these displays of affection. But in another sense, Boswell is dead wrong, because it does not follow from this that Russians are more tolerant of homosexuality, because, in fact, this is not at all an expression of same-sex eroticism. The phenomena of men kissing each other on the lips is, in fact, part of the tradition we call romantic friendship. In other words, what we are seeing here is not Russian tolerance of homosexuality, but rather the absence of homosexuality as a specific category in Soviet history. As we learned from David Halpern earlier in the semester, the term romantic friendship refers to intimate relationships between people of the same sex that, while lacking an explicitly erotic dimension, are nevertheless full of passion and emotional connections that sometimes surpass those of romantic love. This tradition, Halpern tells us, goes back to ancient Greece, where philosophers like Aristotle championed platonic love above all other kinds of relationships. In these kinds of friendships, the idea was that a single mind and a single heart was shared between two people. For us today, it is difficult to separate this from homoeroticism or from the idea of latent homosexuality. But those who wrote about this in the past thought that romantic friendships were entirely devoid of erotic passion. Indeed, since these relationships were things that involved people of similar ranks, stations, or statuses, the idea that they could be sexual was unthinkable, at least not until quite recently. Within Russia, these kinds of relationships have been documented among men back to the 18th and 19th centuries. Available evidence suggests that they became particularly popular in the era of Tsar Nicholas I, when a class of young radical intellectuals emerged within Russian academia. Perhaps the best-known example of this was the friendship of Nicholas Ogarev and Alexander Herzen. After meeting in the 1830s at Moscow University, the two young men developed a friendship that lasted decades, right up until the end of their lives. Their friendship survived foreign travel, marriage, and ultimately exile. In his excellent autobiography, My Past and Thoughts, Herzen makes clear the political dimensions of his very affectionate relationship with Ogarev, writing, quote, "Flushed and breathless, we stood there on Sparrow Hills. The sun was setting, the cupolas glittered, a fresh breeze blew on our faces. We stood leaning against each other and, suddenly embracing, vowed in sight of all Moscow to sacrifice our lives to the struggle we had chosen." Russian men of the 19th century came of age during the age of European Romanticism, when feelings, sentiments, and passionate longings of all types were idealized across the continent. This culture of intimacy between men was thus a pan-European phenomenon. It was particularly observable within all-male environments like colleges and universities, where young men were often so devoted to each other that they not only spent the entire school year together, but also traveled with each other during winter and summer recesses. Their friendships were often public affairs that included a whole host of intimate activities like sharing beds, embracing, and even kissing. This was not thought to threaten the social order, even though it elevated homosocial bonds over relations with women. As evidence of this, consider the diary entries of a 19th century Moscow University student named Yanvar Neverov. Writing to his classmate, Vladimir Rizhetsky, he declared that, quote, "I feel our friendship, and it is the blessing of my soul. As I have already experienced love with a woman, I know its movements in my passionate soul. I am happy that the dream of friendship with Vladimir replaced the dream of love." Again, none of this carried connotations of immorality. What made the Russian case a bit different was that here these relations sometimes went beyond youth. This was certainly the case for Herzen and Ogarev, whose connection continued well after graduation. Throughout their lives, the two continued to correspond, and their letters are filled with repeated declarations of love. In one of his letters, for example, Ogarev notes how he has become dependent on his friend, saying, "Herzen, your soul is essential for my existence." His writings are full of passionate desires, such as when he says, "If I were now sitting near to you, friend, oh, what bliss there would be then! How I need to speak friend to friend! Oh, my Herzen, do not cry that we have been separated. Bite your lip, and in your heart absorb the poisonous feelings, la vendetta." In 1856, decades into their relationship, Herzen wrote to Ogarev of how, quote, "It is my desire to end my life with you, and I believe we shall finish it together, hand in hand." Now, reading such statements, it is only natural to ask, did these kinds of passionate relationships have a sexual component? Was there erotic attachment here? were these young men homosexual? In answering this question, of course, we have to be careful, because, as we know, understandings of love and its connections to eroticism have changed over time. So, was romantic friendship just a euphemism for homosexuality? The historical scholarship on this suggests that in the 19th and early 20th centuries, love and sex occupied somewhat different terrains. While we don't know for sure if these romantic relationships included sexual intercourse, we do know that outsiders made different assumptions about these relationships than we would today. Whereas today, we believe that any two men who are as close as Herzen and Ogarev must have been having sex with each other, that was not what people at the time believed of these relationships. It was only with the growing acceptance of homosexuality as a concept that same-sex romantic friendships fell under suspicion. To be sure, it was during the 19th century that the Russian state first took notice of sodomy. In 1835, this was formally banned throughout the empire, and punishments could be quite severe, including whippings, exile, and the loss of civil rights. But, despite the Tsar's fears, Russia's official culture did very little to prevent or discourage men from forming close friendships with other men. Compared to other Western countries, male intimacy did not create much anxiety in Russia. Passionate embraces and intimate expressions of love actually were key aspects of Russian masculinity during this time, and they continued to find favor well into the Soviet period. We should remember these things when we think about some of the many wonderful images you all shared during last week's conversations, because, unfortunately, there are some scholars who, like John Boswell, try to use these sources of evidence of the fact that modern Western societies are uniquely homophobic, and that in non-Western societies, homosexuality has been neither hated nor stigmatized. In effect, what these scholars are doing is presenting Russia as the West's sexual other, an exoticized, romanticized place whose culture is imagined to be free of the kinds of binaries that force people to be either homosexual or heterosexual. This is an example of cultural imperialism because it exports Western fantasies onto Russia in a way that is designed to help Westerners resolve some of their own frustrations with sexual identity. There is a long history of this, and it is similar to those 19th century European writers who traveled to the Orient because they saw it, as one travelogue put it, quote, as a place where one could look for sexual experiences unobtainable in Europe. This tendency can also be seen in other academic writings as well, including the book Queer in Russia, A Story of Sex, Self, and the Other by Laurie Essig. A sociological analysis of queer sexualities in 20th century Russia, Essig's book presents a totally open sexual landscape where people are fluid and flexible in their desires, resistant to being trapped by Western discourses. In the conclusion of her book, Essig writes that, quote, this is a record, perhaps a fantasy, of a world of multiple desires and flexible identities that have not yet been colonized by Western notions of sex and its meaning. Here again is another example of this cultural imperialism. So again, as we think about these sources, let's be mindful, and let's be cautious about the things that we read into them, because it's possible to do this in a way that actually distorts history. Okay, that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching this video, and please let me know if you have further questions. I hope you enjoyed watching this, and I look forward to seeing you all back in the discussion board for this week's conversations. Until then, stay safe, everybody, and be well. Bye-bye for now.